Hi everybody, I'm Gary Watson and you're watching Issues coming from Mainland Television here in Nelson. Welcome to the program. Tonight we're going to talk about the last antibiotic. We are seeing doctors overprescribing antibiotics. We are seeing antibiotics not being so as effective as what they have in the past. And we are seeing all sorts of mutations and challenges for our scientists and our medical profession. Tonight we have a look at the last antibiotic.
Allied casualties in Normandy received the most expert medical care science can provide. Two modern treatments, penicillin and blood transfusion, have cheated death in thousands of cases. Gangrene, from which millions have perished in past wars, has been conquered by the miracle of penicillin. Thousands of men, thanks to penicillin, will come home to their thankful families. The whole world of peace to come will reap the benefits of this great wartime medical discovery. Science has won another victory over death.
Throughout most of human history, infectious germs have caused death and destruction. For centuries, deadly diseases such as the plague, tuberculosis and gangrene had befallen people all over the world, in the countryside, in cities and on the battlefield.
If you go back 100 years to the mid-19th century, many more soldiers died of infection than died directly from the explosions of cannons. By World War I, already the system was changing because there was a process for handling injured soldiers. But you couldn't cure infection. You could prevent it by bandaging soldiers quickly, but often they suffered gangrene and many soldiers died from infection.
Until the beginning of the 20th century, the risk of infection had made it difficult to treat many types of diseases.
There were significant problems with infections that really limited a lot of what we could do in medicine. For example, staph infections caused significant infections in children and newborns. They contaminated wounds. So, for example, when you were in an automobile accident, there was always this great concern that there would be infection. And so in some cases, you'd almost rather amputate the leg than take the risk that the infection would take off.
The hunt for medicine that can cure dreaded diseases such as syphilis, gonorrhea and pneumonia has been going on since the beginning of civilization. But it was not until the end of the 19th century that the discovery of how infectious diseases are spread came about.
It was a big turning point that it was discovered that single microbes would cause the disease. And the thought was there that if we could find what was then called by Paul Ehrlich a magic bullet, something that would enter the body and seek out the invaders, namely the bacteria, then we could cure the patient without harming the patient.
At the beginning of the 20th century, German doctor Paul Ehrlich developed a substance similar to arsenic with which to treat patients with syphilis. However, this proved to be toxic and had strong side effects. Then, in 1928, Scottish doctor Alexander Fleming accidentally stumbled upon a completely new medicine. One day, whilst working with bacterial cultures, Fleming discovered a spot of mold. It wasn't unusual for Petri dishes to be polluted by fungus, but the odd thing was that the bacteria around the mold had disappeared. Fleming found this fungus, known as penicillin, could prevent the growth of dangerous bacteria such as staphylococci and anthrax. Experiments on rabbits showed that penicillin was apparently harmless, but Fleming didn't succeed in proving that the substance had a curative effect on people. This happened over 13 years later, and penicillin was then mass-produced in the United States.
Through mass production methods, America is continually increasing its output of penicillin, the new drug that effects almost miraculous cures. The liquid medium in these bottles will grow the mold that forms penicillin. All penicillin produced is used by the Allied fighting forces. The liquid now charged with penicillin is poured from the bottles. Turned into a powder, it is ready for use.
The manufacture of penicillin had great significance during World War II. On the cover of Time magazine in May 1944, it said that Fleming's medicine would save more lives than war could spend. Penicillin was widely used to save the lives of soldiers suffering from septicemia, but also to cure different types of diseases among soldiers.
Every time there's a war, the venereal disease rate takes a jump. It's bad enough in peacetime, but now it's like a forest fire. No organization of saboteurs could do half this damage to our army.
One of the characteristic diseases of soldiers are sexually transmitted diseases. If you imagine Europe in 1945, starving women, millions of soldiers, young men, separated from their girlfriends, from their wives, there was the beginning of a terrible syphilis epidemic.
We average 30 venereal disease cases each year out of every 1,000 men in uniform. That means 300,000 men put out of action each year in a 10 million men army. Think of that, 300,000 casualties without even a battle.
You could reasonably say, and I believe this to be sure, that had there not been penicillin, then syphilis would have been for Europe what AIDS later became for Africa. And that memory of this wonder drug is very important in understanding why later we came to assume that penicillin would solve every one of our problems.
In the post-war era, a long line of new antibiotics that could cure many major diseases was developed. Streptomycin, for example, cures tuberculosis, and tetracycline is used to treat pneumonia. In just under 30 years, the mortality rate of young patients suffering from pneumonia fell tenfold.
When antibiotics were introduced, there was a sharp decline in the loss of life and hospitalization of patients with pneumonias, urinary tract infections, skin infections. I think it had an enormous effect. And I think this is why many in the clinical medicine field believe that antibiotics are one of the treasures that we have in our armamentarium to treat patients.
Of course, then it is used not just for the gravely ill, but for people suffering those irritating illnesses which we have every day. The irritating infections, the sore throats, the sore fingers. And of course, maybe even, we think these will not only make my life longer, but also happier.
In fact, you could get penicillin in face creams. You could get it in cosmetics. And the effect of that, of course, was if you had a small infection, it would work. But basically, the whole idea that was conceived was that this was a miracle drug for many different ailments.
In the late 1940s, a new property of antibiotics was discovered which had great influence on the production of pigs, chickens, and other livestock.
One of the manufacturers of a tetracycline, which comes from a soil organism, had this huge pounds and pounds and pounds of the protein left over from the organism after they had extracted their tetracycline. And they wondered if it couldn't be put to some use, such as being used as feed for chickens and other animals. When they added this carcasses of bacteria to the normal feed, they found that the animals grew bigger for less feed. And the discoverers thought they had found a new vitamin.
Rather early on, they realized that it was actually the fact that there was still antibiotics left in this product that made the animals grow faster. And it was then realized that if they just added low amounts, fairly low amounts of antibiotics to the feed throughout the life of the animal, it would grow faster than would otherwise be the case. So antibiotics very quickly became a production tool, not a medicine. It was not even talked about or seen as a medicine.
It changed the industry overnight. Animal producers worldwide began to seek out antibiotics to add back to the feed or buy it already in it. And no one was particularly concerned about what it might be doing outside the animal.
In the 1950s, the sales of antibiotics became big business, and thousands of tons were used to combat disease. And in livestock, it was used as a growth promoter. The miracle drug, however, began to have its drawbacks.
Fairly soon after their introduction, there was a small cloud on the horizon in that initially Staphylococci, which were one of the bacteria, one of the groups of bacteria that one was really concerned about in terms of serious wounds and wound infections, began to show resistance to penicillin.
Pathogenic bacteria could apparently become resistant to penicillin. Back in 1945, in the New York Times, Alexander Fleming warned against the uncontrolled use of penicillin, and also pointed out that taking too small a dose made a good breeding ground, as bacteria could survive small doses. No one took notice of Fleming's warning, and it wasn't until the 1960s that people realized the miracle drug could fail.
Late in 1967, there was a small outbreak of an E. coli in the children's wards in a hospital in northeast of England in Middlesbrough. 11 children died. Almost all of them very weak. They had been born prematurely. And as far as the medical profession was concerned, this was not either unusual or terrifying. It was disturbing because the E. coli which killed these children was resistant to antibiotics. And the press in 1967 realized the public did not know that children were dying in British hospitals of E. coli. This became a terrible scandal, and E.S. Anderson, a very active scientist within the public health laboratory, warned that it was conceivable, he couldn't prove it, but it was possible that the resistance which E. coli had acquired had been developed in animals. So that here was an example, possibly a warning of a much worse epidemic to come.
Hi, I'm John McMillan at the Nelson Power Tool Centre. We have great prices on all the top quality brands of power tool. Tools and equipment at our showroom, 146 Tahunanui Drive in Nelson. The Nelson Power Tool Centre, the specialists that stand behind and service what we sell.
Discover the Belgrove Tavern just 20 minutes south of Richmond on State Highway 6 for meals, functions, weddings, barbecues and garden bar with lots of room for kids. Come and see us.
Oh, to be healthy.
Lifestyle, diet and exercise, complemented with quality supplements, can provide you the insurance vital for your natural health and well-being. With over 10 years professional experience making some of New Zealand's most trusted nutritional supplement brands, visit the O to Be Healthy factory outlet in Wakatu Industrial Estate. Over 200 supplements to choose from, free on-site parking, no middleman.
Oh, to be healthy. Caring for you naturally.
Due to public concern, the British Parliament set up a committee to investigate whether the use of antibiotics in livestock could increase the growth of resistant pathogenic bacteria.
The Swan Committee came up with some very bold conclusions that animals were a source of resistant bacterial infections in humans, and that the use of antibiotics in the animals did make the bacteria in the animals resistant. So they actually claimed and to some extent proved a link between the use of antibiotics in animals and resistant bacteria in humans.
The Swan Committee's recommendations brought about a ban, first in England and later in other European countries. In husbandry, 4 different types of antibiotics were banned, as they're vital in combating human diseases. But the use of other types of antibiotics as growth promoters in livestock continued to rise. In the early 1970s, more and more resistant bacteria types were found. The aggressive Staphylococcus had long since survived penicillin, but up until then, new types of antibiotics had managed to suppress this most dangerous bacteria.
By the time I received my medical training in the early 1970s, there was general acceptance that one never used penicillin for staphylococci. One would occasionally get a patient who came in from the community with a staphylococcal infection that was penicillin sensitive. But that was always something, you know, that was remarkable, that you would comment on. Oh, look, we got an old staphylococci strain that, you know, is still pen sensitive. But we had another drug that was you know, related to the original penicillin design. And so consequently, people didn't think too much about it.
But there were grounds for concern, for in the 1970s, diseases which previously had been partly suppressed returned. The number of cases of tuberculosis began to rise, and gonorrhea could no longer be cured by many types of antibiotics. Many pathogenic bacteria began to show signs of multi-resistance.
If you have a community of bacteria of which 1 or 2 have picked up a resistance trait, and you add the antibiotic, only those with the resistance will survive, and the next thing you know, you have a community of resistant bacteria. And yeah, they are kind of trading weapons. It's almost, you know, like trading baseball cards in which you give me yours, I'll give you yours, but often they don't lose the one they give, they just make another copy and give it to a next bacterium. There's no purpose in it. I mean, this is all events that are happening, but you're talking about millions of bacteria, you know, sitting on the space of the tip of a pin. They're very close together. They can exchange lots of things. And then they separate out, grow again, and if they're confronted with an antibiotic, they'll survive if they're resistant, and they'll die if they don't.
One of the most dreaded bacteria, the golden Staphylococcus aureus, had also become multi-resistant. For several years, Staphylococcus aureus was resistant to penicillin, but now the bacteria could not be suppressed by penicillin's successor, methicillin. MRSA, or the superbug as it's also called, is dreaded in every hospital because it can spread infection during operations and thereby disrupt patient treatment.
You have patients who go in for what should have something they look forward to, what should be a hip surgery which will let them walk again with ease, and instead they emerge, you know, months later after, you know, months of antibiotics, hospitalization, therapy, with a totally dysfunctional joint and complete disability. I mean, what we see is that these are devastating infections, and the increasing problems with treating them can, particularly for individual patients, can be devastating.
On top of a motorcycle accident, MRSA is something Bob Rice really didn't need.
The germ also caused infections in other areas. On many of his sites where he had what we call the donor sites for plastic surgery, plus other open areas, and including the intravenous access site that he needed so he could receive fluids and drugs. And he got an infection on what we call a central line, which is placed up here into one of the large veins. And then he developed infection in his bloodstream from that required ongoing and quite prolonged antibiotics.
Roger Pudney was not so lucky. An abscess in one leg from a suspected spider bite changed his life, for the worse. For 6 months, he was isolated and pumped full of antibiotics. But Roger Pudney lost the fight. The only recourse was amputation.
MRSA bacteria quickly spread round the world, much to the concern of health authorities, as there was now a diminishing number of new types of antibiotics which could substitute previous ones. The drug industry had practically given up on finding new types of antibiotics.
It's risky. I mean, they have already looked very hard without finding anyone, so the chance that they are going to find something very effective is not as high as it was in the past. And also, even if they find a drug, getting it approved is a very lengthy and very costly process that also has a very high risk of not leading to a product that goes to market at the end of the day. So industry is prone to go in other direction where there is more chance of making a profit.
The dreaded multi-resistant MRSA could still be wiped out by one antibiotic, vancomycin, which is one of medical science's last big guns to be fired at advancing bacteria. Vancomycin, however, also had drawbacks when treating another bacteria strain, namely the less aggressive Enterococcus bacteria vancomycin-resistant enterococci, or VRE.
We picked up the first strain of VRE in 1989, and we sort of thought, you know, again, when these things show up as sort of an oddity, you know, the director of the clinical microbiology laboratory called me up and said, you know, guess what we found? It was sort of exciting, fun, novel, and we didn't think that much about it. But then all of a sudden, you know, over the next year or two, we started seeing more of them, and more of them, and more of them. And it stopped being a novelty and started to become a very serious medical problem.
Up to this time, vancomycin was beginning to be used to treat the Staph aureus, which was resistant to most other antibiotics. So it was a life-saving antibiotic. So now you see another bacterium carrying vancomycin resistance. That was not good. And I can remember that there were hospitals that had the problem, but many that did not. But by the mid-1990s, virtually every hospital had VRE.
We had deaths in this hospital due to vancomycin-resistant enterococci. Deaths where if the patient had been infected with a susceptible enterococci, we could have saved them. These were patients who we had done horrendous things to, in the sense of, you know, these were patients who had had cancer chemotherapy or a bone marrow transplant or something similar. But again, we had done the bone marrow transplant with the assumption that we could always treat whatever infection resulted. And now suddenly we could no longer give patients that reassurance. We can no longer tell them, don't worry if you become infected, we can treat it. And so we had deaths.
In just a few years, VRE bacteria were widespread. A study of American hospitals in 1989 showed that under 0.5% of bacteria were resistant, a figure which would rise 4 years later to an astounding 10%. The spread of VRE caused much concern, even more so when Danish studies showed that VRE bacteria developed during pig and chicken production by a growth promoter that's related to vancomycin. So, resistant bacteria in animals were ruining the effect of a vital drug for humans.
The use of avopacin did select for vancomycin-resistant enterococci in swine production and in poultry production. And we proved that resistance genes that encode resistance in the bacteria were the same in those animals that could be found in the food and in the humans. And we also showed that resistant enterococci could transmit from animals to food and most likely also to humans.
The Danish studies resulted in a ban by the European Union. First, avopacin was banned in 1996, and during the next 10 years, all growth promoters were similarly banned. Nevertheless, the development of resistant bacteria didn't stop, which for hospitals proved to be a grave problem. The American health authorities estimated that 1 in every 20 patients became infected by pathogenic bacteria whilst in hospital. Resistant bacteria quickly spread in countries where antibiotics were administered without doctor consultation. And in countries where antibiotics were prescription drugs, patients pressured doctors to prescribe antibiotics even when it wasn't necessary. The World Health Organization estimated that in the treating of bronchial infections, up to 80% of antibiotic use was completely unnecessary.
Overuse and misuse does no purpose therapeutically, and all it does is recruit more resistance. Treat the patient, get him well, that's it. But if you use it for 5 times more than it's needed, or you use it when there's a cold virus and there's no bacterium, it's a misuse that does have an impact, because you wipe out the susceptible kinds of bacteria and you allow the resistant ones to take over.
Resistant pathogenic bacteria has recently been classified as one of the world's 3 greatest health problems. As the World Health Organization states, the pipeline of new drugs is running dry. Today, old diseases are re-emerging with a vengeance. Tuberculosis, for instance, is now one of the world's biggest killers, with over 2 million people dying from it every year, and with some of them dying of a new multi-resistant tuberculosis bacteria.
We think that there are about 500,000 multi-drug resistant TB cases every year around the world, and the absolute most difficult areas is the countries of the former Soviet Union. The problem is MDR-TB in prisons, and one of the reasons is that prisoners are malnourished, they are vulnerable, they may have HIV, so they are vulnerable to get TB. Prisons are overcrowded. I mean, people live in so small areas, so they have to sleep in shifts, and that means that if someone has MDR-TB, it's transmitted very rapidly to others. So the prisons in these countries have really been the source of the MDR-TB epidemic. The situation is really, really scary in the former Soviet Union, and also places in China where the rates are very, very high. But we must be careful all around the world, because TB doesn't stop at borders.
For the last 50 years, the age of antibiotics, we have had, if you will, a free ride. It's been wonderful. And what will happen is that we will be moving into what has been termed the post-antibiotic era, where suddenly we go back to the way we were in the 1920s and 1930s, where infection was the killer.
Finding new antibiotics is not easy. That companies that could do it are not doing it. And so as resistance gets worse, new drugs are lagging behind. That makes the problem even worse.
The concern that I have is that while today I may be telling you we're hanging by our fingernails, 5 years from now, I may be telling you, you know, I'm not hanging on anymore. Suddenly, I have microorganisms which are not able to be treated with that one last antibiotic that I have left.
Discover the Belgrove Tavern, just 20 minutes south of Richmond on State Highway 6. For meals, functions, weddings, barbecues and garden bar with lots of room for kids. Come and see us.
Nelson Tire Center. Great prices, great service. Buy your own Bryford trailer. All types, all sizes. See Colin Douglas for your tires and batteries.
Now, in one lifespan, the future came rushing in like an avalanche. Here was power, unbelievably versatile power, titanically muscle power, leaping to any task. Incredibly delicate power, responding with instant precision to the tiniest signal. With the birth of the electrical age, a nation's standard of living surged forward.
The prevalence of electricity has been a key factor in industrialization, so its use as an energy form in most types of products has, through time, skyrocketed. And a certain group of chemical substances, PCB for one, because of its being a kind of liquid electric insulation, has played a significant role in the distribution of electricity. PCB, first commercially manufactured in 1927, is a syrupy, sticky substance.
There definitely was the right time for this substance because we had learned how to generate electricity. We got the electric light bulb. We began to develop instruments and machines that needed electricity, transformers, generators on telephone poles all across the country. As the electricity came in, they loaded those things with PCBs. And we wouldn't have nationwide distribution of electricity if it hadn't been for the PCBs.
After the introduction of PCB, it was found to have many useful properties for a wide range of products. Not only for its resistance to thermal breakdown, but also because it could make other substances more pliable. Soon, the consumption of PCB quickly rose to several thousand tons.
They were used as hydraulic fluids. They were added to paints, to ceiling tiles, to linoleum. They were used in carbonless paper in the days before the word processor, and many, many domestic uses.
Basically, PCBs became that product that we introduced into practically everything where there was a possibility that this material would catch on fire. Any organic material is going to burn, but by putting PCBs into this organic material, it didn't flame up, it didn't burn, and it slowed down that process. They put it in the concrete, and then the materials that we're putting in our walls so our buildings wouldn't catch on fire. We've saved a lot of lives. We prevented a lot of fires because of the PCBs. They became very much a part of our lives.
In the 1940s and 50s, when the chemical industry was prospering, many new products, such as nylons, plastic containers, fire extinguishing agents and pesticides were launched, along with a number of chemicals which soon began to leave their mark on daily life. But by the early 60s, some of these new chemical substances were suspected of contaminating both nature and, perhaps, people. One such substance was the insecticide DDT, which had been dispersed over cities and fields since the 1940s in order to combat diseases and vermin, resulting later in traces of it being found not only in various species of birds, but also in agricultural products such as eggs, milk, butter and meat. But when scientists began to trace DDT in humans, that wasn't all they found.
I got the task to analyze the Swedes for DDT. And found, of course, DDT, but I did more than that, because in the chromatograms that showed the DDT, there were 8 unknown peaks, each of them representing one substance. But we did not know what it was.
At Stockholm's Museum of Natural History, eagle feathers have been collected since 1888. When Søren Jensen began examining them, he found that from 1942 onward, there was a particular chemical which peaked, but which wasn't DDT. And when, after 2 years' research, Søren Jensen found excessively large concentrations of these chemicals in a dead white-tailed eagle, he managed to isolate and identify the unknown substances as being PCB, and discovered them in some rather unexpected places.
Just for curiosity, I analyzed my own hair, my wife's hair, and all the kids. And it turned up that I had the highest level, my wife also very high. And among the children, the youngest, still breastfeeding, had the highest level of both PCB and DDT. I think that many societies got more or less a shock, because in the past you have learned that DDT was spread onto the vegetation to fight against insects and so. But all knowledge about PCB was that it was used in closed system. And how could it come out then? Because half a year after the discovery, it was found all over the world.
PCBs had apparently leaked from machines, buildings and electrical appliances into the environment. And as became evident, PCB, just like DDT, is accumulated in the food chain right from minute quantities in microorganisms and small herbivores to quantities millions of times higher at the top of the food chain, in carnivores and humans. It was, however, as yet still not widely acknowledged that PCBs were harmful to people. That is, until a serious food poisoning accident in a Japanese food factory in 1968 shed new light on the chemicals.
There was an accident where the PCBs actually leaked into the cooking oil. And when people ate food prepared with this cooking oil, they developed skin rashes, they developed tingling of the fingertips and the toes. In other words, it was a toxic exposure.
Around 1,300 Japanese people were poisoned by PCB-infested cooking oil, contracting both serious skin and respiratory illnesses, as well as disturbances of vision. Contamination was also later traced in their children.
Another consequence of this toxic exposure was that when women gave birth to children, the children were born with certain abnormalities, skin rashes, early eruption of teeth. And this was an indication that not only did the person who ate the cooking oil get damaged, but the fetus could be damaged if a pregnant woman ate this cooking oil.
This accident in Japan is quite unique and cannot be compared to the PCB dosage people can get from nature. Nevertheless, soon there was increasing concern about the spread of PCB pollution. In the Great Lakes area bordering the US and Canada, signs of an increase in PCB pollution was also becoming evident.
Wildlife biologists were finding all kinds of problems among the wildlife around the Great Lakes, the fish, the birds, the mammals, and actually populations actually were extirpated. In other words, they disappeared. The animals were having trouble reproducing. Male birds were behaving like female birds, female-female pairing. The birds were not attending to their young when they did lay an egg. Now, there were other organochlorine chemicals there as well. They found a lot of chlorinated pesticides, and they began to find dioxin. But PCBs seemed to be the one that they focused on because it was most frequently found.
Even the world's largest manufacturers of PCB, Monsanto, began expressing concern in an internal memo in case consumers would be suing the company for not having issued warnings of its harmful effects. Monsanto also stated simultaneously that PCB problems not only affected the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe, but that other areas of the world were also likely to be prone.
10 million pounds of PCBs end up in the environment every year. The chemicals concentrate in the tissues of fish from PCB-polluted waters. People eat the fish, and PCBs build up in their tissues, too. There's reason for concern. University of Wisconsin researchers fed monkeys diets containing as little as half the maximum amount of PCBs currently allowed in fish for human consumption. The animals suffered serious effects, such as reproductive problems and miscarriages.
There may be subtle effects
things that we cannot see, things that may manifest themselves 20 or 30 years hence, that may be a result of exposure to extremely low levels of PCBs.
The uncertainties of using PCB were considerable, and in 1971, Sweden was the first country to ban it, followed 6 years later by the United States, who prohibited its production and usage in new products.
The decision to require that manufacturers stop was really based on the fact that these substances were persistent. In the environment, PCBs have a half-life of at least something like 20 to 30 years. And under certain circumstances in the environment, they don't degrade at all. They will remain for hundreds of years, if not forever. So the fact that a man-made chemical was accumulating both in sediments of rivers and streams and in soils, and particularly in wildlife and humans, was reason enough to mandate that its manufacture and use be stopped.
In the late 1970s, American authorities conducted examinations of anglers in the Great Lakes area and found PCB levels to be 10 times higher than normal, ostensibly because anglers and their families often ate the polluted fish they caught. Among the adult anglers, there were no immediate symptoms of poisoning, but authorities ordered another study, this time of babies whose mothers had high levels of PCB, and analyzed the link between PCB levels in the baby's umbilical cords and in their ability to learn.
It's a test where the baby looks at two identical photographs, and the examiner looks through a peephole to see is the baby really looking at the photograph. And after the baby has looked for 20 seconds, that's enough time for a normal baby to remember the first photograph. Then one of the photographs is switched. So now the baby is seeing the original photograph and another slightly different one. The normal response will be to look longer at the new photograph. If the baby looks longer at the new photograph, we know that they have encoded the old photograph, the original photograph, in memory. So we can see that their basic ability to encode information from visual stimuli is intact. What we found with the PCBs was that the children who were exposed to the highest levels of PCBs looked equal at the two photographs. They did not encode that initial photograph in short-term memory. By using this very refined test of visual recognition memory, we were able to see that their ability to process information was actually impaired by this exposure. And we were talking about levels of exposure that potentially anybody in the general population at that time could have been getting.
Whoa, look at this.
These studies aroused much concern, and authorities began to warn against eating fish lest it be contaminated with PCB.
Hello, I'm Patty Lowe. In this program, we will fish for the answers. Fishing is fun for the whole family, and fish is health food, high in protein, low in cholesterol and fat. Stop. Do you know that no matter where it was caught, sport fish may contain toxic chemicals?
Because the levels in the fish that were being used for human consumption were at levels that clearly posed risk of accumulating in people, our federal agencies began to issue advisories since the mid-1980s. Do not eat fish. These advisories continue to be in effect. For example, in the Great Lakes, there's a general advisory that one should not eat fish from the Great Lakes.
The majority of information in our life comes to us through our vision. With only one set of eyes to last our lifetime, it's important that you look after them. For over 20 years, Carrington Eye Care has led the way in providing the Nelson Tasman region with professional eye care. Our team are committed to providing you and your family with the highest standard of eye care. As part of this commitment at Carrington Eye Care, we recommend Crizal lenses. Crizal is a revolutionary lens which repels dust and fingerprints. This means it's easier to clean and stays cleaner longer. Visit us at our Nelson, Richmond practices and ask about our Crizal satisfaction guarantee.
Waimea Telecommunications, specializing in free-to-air digital television, internet broadband connections, telephone and telecommunications systems. Call Julian Toon at Waimea Telecommunications on 544-4203.
In the late 80s, Joseph Jacobson followed up on his earlier studies of the learning ability of these babies. The children's IQs were tested when they were 4 years old and again when they were 11.
What we found was that the prenatal PCB exposure, which was at quite low levels, predicted lower IQ scores. On the average, the most heavily exposed children had IQ scores about 6.5 points lower than the other children in the cohort. And what that told us is that this prenatal exposure had a very substantial long-term impact on cognitive function. It was seen particularly on verbal abilities and particularly on reading comprehension.
All right, let's go. Come on. All right, ready? You swing right.
For one individual, a 5 to 7 point IQ decrement probably isn't so terribly significant. For society, this is extremely significant. Shifting the IQ curve down in a population reduces your number of geniuses, increases your number of retarded people, and from a societal point of view is a dumbing down of the population. And so, yes, it may not make an enormous difference for one individual, but in terms of productivity from society and the cost to society, this is a very, very major factor. And in my judgment, that probably is the most dangerous health outcome of the many from these compounds.
Jacobson's findings attracted attention, but it's still unclear why extremely small doses of PCB could have a decisive influence on the development of a fetus.
It was about 1988 when I pulled all this information together about the Great Lakes and, you know, all the wildlife information, and also pulled together this particular study. And we looked and we said, well, my goodness, it looks like we have chemicals here that are not affecting the adult animals, but their offspring. The endocrine system, or the hormonal system that controls development, kicks in the minute the sperm enters the egg, and the cells begin to split. The first neuronal cells in the brain, these are the little nerve cells that develop, can be affected by these chemicals. There are studies that looked at PCBs in mothers of children, and these children had temperament problems, learning problems, and memory problems. So, my goodness, we've been testing chemicals to see if they cause cancer on adult animals. We've been testing them on adult animals to see if they cause convulsions, see if they cause skin and eye irritation, and also to look to see if they cause mutations. And if they didn't cause those effects, we thought they were safe.
By the late 80s, there was an increasing awareness that PCB accumulated in the fatty tissue of carnivorous mammals. And in Canada, it was noted that whales near the St. Lawrence had such high concentrations of PCB and other chemicals that in fact they should be classified as toxic waste. Mammals in the Arctic region also had high PCB levels. But to what extent the pollution had affected people in the Arctic areas was still unknown. But then, by chance, one of Joseph Jacobson's colleagues showed an interest in conducting further investigations.
He had originally gone up to the Arctic because he was interested in problems of lead exposure in children. And he thought the Inuit would be an excellent control group because they live in a pristine environment. And he learned by doing some blood tests on the children that the population of Inuit in the Arctic are very heavily exposed not only to lead but also to PCBs and methylmercury. And this was a surprise to everybody.
The Canadian authorities decided to investigate PCB pollution in more detail and chose Broughton Island, 800 kilometers north of the polar circle. Here, the island's 450 inhabitants eat traditional foods such as seals, which are among some of the most contaminated of species. The results of the study were shocking. For industrial accidents aside, the inhabitants showed the highest ever recorded concentrations of PCB. 2 out of 3 children on Broughton Island had concentrations of PCB well over and above any acceptable level.
From that report, people were, especially younger generation, were very affected. They even want to stop eating country food that was involved, that had a blubber in it.
It was said that the Inuit people from neighbouring areas would no longer marry inhabitants from Broughton Island. They called them the PCB people. Yet further studies showed that Inuit people around Arctic Canada and Greenland all had high concentrations of PCB, up to 7 times the level of people in Europe and the US.
It's an absolute tragedy. And this is one of the best examples of environmental injustice, because these people have had none of the benefits. They live in an environment where they must be dependent on local sources of food, and those of us in the industrial world have contaminated those food sources.
The pollution of the Arctic areas, not just with PCB, but also other hazardous industrial chemicals and crop sprays, was deemed unacceptable by the international community, and by the 1990s, the UN's Environment Programme, UNEP, placed the matter high on its agenda. In Bonn, Geneva and Stockholm, at the one conference after another, discussion finally led to a convention which banned outright 12 of the most harmful chemicals, including PCB. And in 2003, this convention was signed by 127 countries.
It's going to be a model for our working globally to deal with chemicals, because the chemicals that are getting to us are the ones that are produced in extremely high volumes, that are integrated into the products that we're bringing into our homes. These are the ones we're concerned about. In our schools, in our buildings, our automobiles, everywhere we go, we're exposed to these things. And every other country in the world wants these same wonderful pieces of modern technology that have these chemicals in. So unless we address this on a global scale, we're not going to solve the problem.
Although the production of PCB has finally been stopped, PCB is still present in thousands of electrical installations, buildings, and in the environment. One of the many places where PCB is still found in great quantities is the Hudson River on the east coast of America. And not surprisingly, for up until 1977, General Electric alone had released just under 1,000 tons directly into the river.
So now we have 200 miles of the Hudson River from Hudson Falls to Manhattan that is contaminated and is on our national priority list of most contaminated sites that pose risks to human health. Our EPA has recently determined that the most contaminated parts of the Hudson River will be dredged. That is, that the contaminated sediments will be dug up and removed from the river. However, what do we do with these contaminated sediments? At the moment, the only mechanism that we have that's recommended by the EPA for destroying PCBs in sediments is to incinerate them, which is outrageously expensive. And in fact, this is not a realistic way of getting rid of the PCBs. So what is expected to be done with the dredged material from the Hudson River is to put it in a secure landfill.
The total expense of removing PCBs from contaminated mud in the Hudson is estimated to be $460 million. And despite great effort, it's still unclear whether fish will ever be safe to eat. But PCB is not only to be found in our environment, it's inside each and every one of us, and through childbirth is passed down by us to future generations. June of 2004, during an international conference, the World Wildlife Fund took blood samples from 13 European ministers for the environment. Their blood was tested for 77 different chemicals. New substances, for instance, such as softeners and bromated flame retardants, as well as previously banned substances like DDT and PCB. The tests found 55 chemicals in their blood, with the most common chemical group being PCB, and no less than 22 different kinds of PCB. A World Wildlife Fund follow-up showed that women who have given birth have a significantly lower concentration of PCB, simply because the more children they have, the more PCB they've involuntarily passed on to them during pregnancy and breastfeeding.
We've let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, and it's difficult to put it back. There are many chemicals that are harmful to people, but at least when we stop using them, we stop the exposures. Unfortunately, with these compounds, because of their persistence, you can't stop the exposure just because we don't manufacture them any longer.
Can you stay how many days?
Even today, we don't have one assay to test a chemical for how it affects the construction of our children from conception to birth. You find something that makes a great plastic, wow, this is terrific. We'll test it for cancer, doesn't cause cancer. We know that's not enough. We have to test for now what happens from the day the sperm enters the egg until that individual is born or hatched, whether it's a human, a laboratory animal, or wildlife. And we do not have that.
Well, all very interesting about antibiotics and the challenges for our scientists and medical profession. I note recently in the news they are using the HIV virus. They've changed it and they are putting it into people with cancer, and it's having a great success rate. So let's hope our scientists and our medical people are able to beat this one, where some of these viruses and the likes of are becoming resistant to antibiotics. From all the team here at Mainland Television, we look forward to your company next week. In the meantime, if you have an issue you would like us to look at or have any comments on the program, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at issues@7-media.net.
Hi, my name's Ian Mortimer. Mortimer Auto Upholstery is your one-stop shop for all your upholstery needs. We do car and boat interiors, boat canopies, ute tonneau covers, canvas and PVC fabrication. Call in and see us in Oxford Mews, 72 Oxford Street, Richmond.